Change is really what I'm here to talk about, because we as a society and a church, we desperately need new leaders because we need change, right? We need change in our church, we need change in society, and this is part of your job as Diocesan Pastoral Council, is to serve and to lead in a way that brings about that change. Now, part of the reason, here, first of all, I want to give a little background about what Jesus has to say about this. One of my favorite stories about leadership from Jesus has to do with James and John coming to Jesus and asking if we could be on your right hand and your left, Jesus, when you come in glory. And Jesus' response to this is, I think, very interesting, because he doesn't tell them that it's wrong for them to want to be up front. He doesn't say that it's wrong to have this instinct of wanting to lead. What he does is he transforms the way we think about leadership by looking at, first of all, the Romans. He calls them the Gentiles, and look at the Gentiles and how they lord it over them. I would suggest this is what we would call pedestal leadership, where you lead from on a pedestal. And Jesus says, not so with you. Not so with you. That's not the way I want you to lead. I want you to lead as a servant in my church. And so this is a whole new paradigm of leadership that Jesus is suggesting at that particular time. And I find it interesting that the apostles needed this reminder on numerous occasions. Through the Synoptic Gospels, we get these stories about how the apostles would be arguing about which one of them is the best and which one of them is the greatest. Even at the Last Supper, where this picture is taken from the what they think was the upper room where Jesus and the apostles held the Last Supper, Luke's report says that just before the Last Supper, they still had this debate about which one of them is the greatest. And Jesus had to give them the reminder, 3 years into this leadership training that he's been providing, and they're still human enough, which I think is very comforting, that the apostles were also very human, especially Peter, right? Very human beings who have to have this reminder from Jesus that it's really not all about you, okay? It's about providing service to each other and to the church, okay? So that's the reminder that Jesus gives us, and Pope Francis is giving us lots of material for servant leadership. Every day we hear stories, don't we? It's just really fun to read his homilies and to hear the stories of the very humble way that Pope Francis has given us as an example, a role model for this thing we call servant leadership. And when he was in Brazil talking to the youth, he suggested to them that the two things that give them their action plan would be, he said, read the Beatitudes and read Matthew 25. And so I was inspired actually from one of my trips to the Middle East and going to Galilee. This is my son sitting at the Sea of Galilee. And just being there in that particular part of the world inspired me to write about the Beatitudes, because I find the Beatitudes to be such a font of wisdom. This is the Church of the Beatitudes on the Mount of the Beatitudes. And these Beatitudes really are literally the blessings that Jesus gives us to think about life and leadership within the church. The other thing, Matthew 25, is this great familiar story we have, right, about the sheep and the goats. And I find it real interesting that in the story of Matthew 25, it's the righteous that do the works of mercy. This really connects a lot of the Beatitudes for me too, because in the Beatitudes, it's the righteous that we talk about in the 4th and the 8th Beatitude. And I would suggest that the word righteous is what we mean in the offertory prayer when we say, it is right and just. It is right and just. To be righteous is to be right with God and just with the people. And in Matthew 25, Jesus lays out what it means to be righteous, because that's the word he uses to describe the sheep who are on the right in the story of the sheep and the goats. And he says that the righteous are the ones who do the works of mercy, who shelter the homeless, who feed the poor. Okay? So it comes down to, how do we treat each other? And this is a very striking message for the people in first century Palestine, because in their minds, salvation was really about being Jewish and about keeping the law. And if you were Jewish and kept the law, then you were to be saved. And Jesus is saying, no, it has a lot to do with how we treat each other. And we treat each other in indiscriminate ways that, even when a person doesn't deserve that kind of treatment, we still treat them with that kind of respect. And so that's part of the way we want to think about leadership, is how do we lead? Well, it has a lot to do with how do we treat each other. And so that becomes a part of this new model. The other part of the new model for leadership has to do with change. And quite frankly, we're living in a world of ever-increasing change. It's becoming the only constant, is that change is going to be there tomorrow and then the next day and the next day. And the old model of planning, strategic planning, which is part of your role as DPC, was really to go up to the top of a mountain. The blue mountaintop kind of experience was the old model of planning. You'd go to the top of the mountain with your top leaders and officials from an organization, and they would come down 5 or 10 days later and say, here's the plan. This is what we're going to do. Just like Moses coming off the mountain. And I would suggest that today's model is more like whitewater rafting, okay? We're coming down that mountain together. The change is swirling all around us. We have to hold on to each other and trust each other to make the right moves at any given moment. We have to make quick decisions. And that's why we need simple rules and core values to be able to think outside the box, okay? The box would refer to the way we usually do things around here, but inside the circle, okay? The circle would represent canon law. And what does it mean to be Catholic in our Holy Scriptures? This provides the outer limits to which we can think outside the box. But there should be plenty of room to think outside that box, but inside the circle, okay? And that's part of leadership, is creating opportunities to think more creatively, innovatively about what it is that we're doing as church. Because, folks, quite frankly, we have a lot of challenges as church, right? We have empty pews. We have people who need to be inspired and more engaged in the church. We have young adults who we need to reach out to and bring back into the church. These are just a few of our challenges. Now, sociologists would say that as organizations face increasing change, they need to become faster, flatter, and more flexible. And the flatter means we need to flatten out our bureaucracies and allow teams and commissions like yours, the council here, to make some decisions. Okay, so and that's what we mean by bureaucracy, is that there's actually bureaus or divisions of a very large organization. The word bureaucracy was originally meant to be a very positive term. Max Weber invented this concept by looking at the Catholic Church and applied it then to business organizations and said, this is what you need to do to provide structure to very large organizations. In a speeding environment with lots of change, you need even more of that bureaucracy, because bureaucracy basically is how a very large organization gets smaller in order to react to quick change. And if we don't change, then we experience entropy. Entropy is a biological principle that suggests that every living organism is in the process of dying, all right? Because there are these biological entropic forces that are imposing on every tree, every animal, and every human being, quite frankly, all of us. But if we think about our church as a living organism, then entropic forces of change all around us, the secular culture that we exist in, are imposing entropic forces upon us that we have to be able to respond, adjust, and adapt to. Okay, that's really a big part of what leaders do. So when we put the relationship and the task together, this is the classic textbook definition of leadership, all right? It's a process of relating to others in an interactive and voluntary way, okay? That's the first part, is the relationship, to move in the direction of a common goal or a shared vision. And part of your role as DPC is to be able to identify what is that common goal. What is our shared vision as church? And a shared vision doesn't just mean the vision of the bishop or the pastor or a few people. It means something that we create together, okay? Bishop was saying that yesterday. People ask him, what's your vision? I remember my bishop, Martin Amos, who came from Cleveland to Davenport, Iowa, he was first asked by the Quad City Times, our local paper, before he even moved to Davenport or even visited there. The reporters were asking him, so Bishop, what's your vision for the Diocese of Davenport? And he responded, he said, well, we're going to have to wait till I get there and we'll figure it out together, okay? It's something that we figure out together. His instincts were right. A vision is something we create together. It's co-created by the people. The charismatic leader who proclaims the I have a dream type vision, all right, that's a dangerous kind of leadership, actually, all right? Because charismatic leadership, a lot of times, inspires people to be blindly obedient and not think for themselves. And we need everybody thinking for themselves. We need everybody's perspective to come up with the best possible solutions to the challenges that we face as church. because the young adults in the room are going to give us a perspective of the young adult that we need to know in order to figure out how are we going to reach out to young adults and bring them to become more actively engaged in the church. So it takes all of us. And on the relationship side, scholars would agree now that the relationship of leadership has to be voluntary. It has to be interactive. The exchange has to go both ways. It's got to be multi-directional. It's got to be listening and responding, finding your voice when you need to find your voice, but listening to the voice of others is both a big part of leadership. So coercion is not leadership. Commanding, controlling, dictating, these are not part of the leadership equation. Okay? This is not part of the way we think about leadership in scholarly ways. And I would suggest that this is consistent with God-like ways of moving. Okay? Aquinas teaches that God interacts with humans through love, through truth, and through beauty. These three ways, all right? Not through almighty ways that we oftentimes think of God the Father, but through love and truth and beauty, because God is love, and God is truth, and God is beauty. Okay? And so when we have positions of authority, when we might have almighty power in a committee that we're on, we need to think about leading in a God-like fashion by interacting with others in our groups in loving and truthful and beautiful ways, rather than dictating the change that we want to see. All right? So leadership is really about engaging in a dialogue where we come up with the best answers together. We reach the synergy that only teams can reach when they move together in a loving and truthful and beautiful way, where they trust each other to come up with the best answers to the challenges that we face. So when you put all the pieces together, this is what the model looks like. All right? The task of leadership is about change. It's about the vision. It's about strategy. Where are we going as an organization? It's about direction, which is vision, and it's about purpose, which is mission. The relationship of leadership has to be voluntary and interactive. It's about inviting, inspiring, and influencing people so that they're intrinsically motivated to be a part of the movement that we want to see in the church. Management, on the other hand, is a very key function in any organization, including the church. All right, so management is a very key part, but the task of management has to do with providing structure to an organization. Creating order out of chaos is what Max Weber would say in the best sense of bureaucracy. Or providing the day-to-day operations like HR and IT, all right? The very important technical kinds of support that we get from the people who are videotaping this conference today. That's all a part of management, and we need good management. We need management of our finances, all right? So that's an important function in any organization. And now on the relationship side, you know, management can be very forceful, because sometimes we do have to discipline people, and sometimes we do have to direct people in how to go about a certain task. But when we're directing people, that's not leadership, okay? It's management. And we really need both leadership and management like any organization. I work in corporations sometimes, and I've heard a number of CEOs say this: I want my people to lead, not to manage. And I would suggest that when they're saying that, what they're really talking about is they want people to lead, which is the left bottom-hand quadrant here, okay? They want their people to invite and inspire and intrinsically motivate the other people, because they're going to get above and beyonds that way, okay? When you treat somebody like a subordinate, you get subordinary behavior. That's what the word suggests. If you want extraordinary behavior, then you need to get them engaged, okay? You need to get those above and beyonds, and that's what you get by treating people on the relationship side through leadership. Now, when leadership was first being measured at the University of Michigan in the 50s, this was the paradigm, okay? This was the model. They basically measured leadership between task and relationship. Points on the line, and you could be a 1 through a 10. So a 7 would be somebody who's very relational, okay? And a 2 would be somebody who's very task-oriented in their leadership. And I would suggest that there's still some truth in this particular model, but at Ohio State they came up with a better model, because they put the two axes of task and relationship together in such a way that now you create the possibility for this model, okay? Where you put task on the vertical axis, relationship on the horizontal axis, and you have these 4 quadrants. And so you have a Q1 person, like a Q1 boss would be somebody who's very authoritarian, okay? It's my way or the highway, All right? They like to dictate the change. But they're very task-driven. They get things done. And the research shows that you can be Q1 and get people to get things done in the short run. It works. But in the long term, people begin to fade away. And eventually what people do with a Q1 kind of authority figure all the time is they move to Q2. All right? Q2 is just like, okay, whatever you say. I'll comply with whatever the orders are. And compliance is not what you want. You want people engaged. You want people inspired. You want them to be energetic about what they're doing in their church ministry, right? And so Q2 is this passive-aggressive. They're passive on the task, and they're aggressive on the relationship. They're hostile, okay? Q2 is your worst nightmare. Whether it's your boss or it's a subordinate, Q2 behavior is your worst nightmare. Q3, very friendly kind of person, right? They're very, they want everybody to like them. They want everybody to have fun. But there's no task getting done. And if you really want the respect of your people, I would suggest that you need to move to Q4. Okay, so moving to Q4, and this is tough because this is a quantum leap for most people. It's not in either or. It's not like Q1 plus Q3 gets you to Q4. Okay, we move back and forth between Q1 and Q3 often. In fact, the line that we first had at the University of Michigan, this line here, it's still here because people move generally from Q1 to Q3. All right, we're very task-oriented 1 minute, and then we socialize with the people down here. But what we're talking about in Q4 is being able to be assertive on the task and cooperative on the relationship at the same time. Okay, that's the new model of leadership. Now, all of us lean one way or the other on this model, right? We all have a tendency to either be more task-oriented or more relationship-oriented. And we need to ask ourselves, which part of that line do we fall on? And how can we become either more assertive, if that's what we need to do to move out of Q3 behavior, or how can we become more cooperative when we get that opportunity to lead? All right, so transition time. We're going to talk now about servant leadership. So when we put that word, servant, in front of leadership, how does that change the paradigm? How does that change how we think about leadership, now that we've defined leadership? Well, Robert Greenleaf, an AT&T executive, was the first person to put these two words together. And he did this when reading a book, Journey to the East by Hermann Hesse, where there's a servant, Leo, who provides a sense of purpose and direction to the pilgrimage to the East. And in the process of doing this, all right, Leo provides a lot of leadership, even though he's the servant of the pilgrimage. And so at the end of the book, we find out that Leo is also the titular head of a monastic order. And this is what now inspires Greenleaf to think about putting these two words together, that the servant can be the leader, and the leader can be the servant. It can start from either direction. But the primary thing is that the servant leader is motivated first to serve and then to lead. Okay? Now, if you stop with the serving, then that doesn't make you a servant leader. You have to feel passionate about some kind of change. And you begin to influence others to join you in that change. And then you realize that it's really about serving people in the midst of that change that makes you the more effective leader. Okay? And this is a very effective way of thinking about leadership. Now, of course, this is very consistent with what Jesus has taught us. All right, there's lots of scriptural references. Jesus didn't put those two words together, but basically talked much about servant leadership. In fact, a lot of the very best stuff on servant leadership predates Jesus. I mean, you can go back to Moses and Confucius and Lao Tzu, okay? 2,600 years ago, this is what the Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu said about leadership. He said that of the best leaders, the people will say, when the job is finished, we did it ourselves, okay? That's pretty wise thinking about leadership for 2,600 years ago. But that's the kind of leadership that we're talking about here, where it's not just all about me as the leader. It's not about getting up on a pedestal, and it's not the narcissism that comes with charismatic leadership. It's really about putting yourself at the service of others, and then the focal point becomes the followers. It's a follower-centric approach. So the question in servant leadership is, are the followers becoming healthier and happier? Are they becoming freer and more likely to become servants and servant leaders themselves? That's the ultimate test of whether the servant leadership is working. All right, so servant leadership, the core of it, and this is from the Sea of Galilee here, is putting the needs and interests of others ahead of your own. Okay? It's about serving the people and serving the mission of the organization, in this case, the church. And servant leadership can come from anywhere. This is a woman who I met on a Catholic Relief Services mission trip to Benin, Africa. Okay? It can come from anywhere, including young women like this, who show us a lot about servant leadership. You don't need a position to be a servant leader. In fact, a lot of times, positions of authority get in the way of being a servant leader, because the temptation is to use that position of authority. You know, it's interesting that the temptations in the desert that Jesus faces before he starts his public ministry all had to do with using earthly power. Okay? That was the temptation that Jesus had to overcome. And I would suggest it's our temptation when we have a position of authority. Whether you're chairing a commission, whether you're leading a small group in a parish, or whether you're the bishop of a diocese or a pastor of a church. Okay? When we have a position of authority, the temptation is always to use that authority instead of using that power that comes from referent power, we call it, or expert power, where we begin to influence people in intrinsic ways so that they're fully engaged, okay, and we get extraordinary kind of results from that. And so, of course, Mother Teresa teaches this just as much, right? The humility, and the word humility comes from the word humus, which is basically the same root of the word human being, okay? To be humble is to be fully human, okay? To recognize both our gifts and our talents on the one hand and our limitations as a human being, okay? And to be truly thoughtful about what it is that I can give to this organization and how do I need others in this process. That's a true sense of humility. That's how Aristotle teaches it, that humility is this middle ground between being selfless and being selfish, okay? Having a real healthy sense of who we are as people. And if we have this sense of humility, then that draws out that whole nature of looking at leadership from the point of view of the follower. Are my followers becoming stronger, healthier, freer, and more likely to become servant leaders themselves? That's the real test of humility as a leader. All right, so I did my research for my doctorate on servant leadership in the context of Catholic parishes in Iowa, and these are the 3 servant leader behaviors that I found in high-performing parishes in Iowa. We're, number 1, recognizing the gifts and talents of people in a parish, okay? Recognizing what people have to offer, what they can bring to the table. And that takes a lot of inviting, and it takes a lot of interaction. It takes a lot of getting to know people in your parishes, okay? And then the empowering is being able to share the power that you have in order to build and enable the capacity of other people to be successful in their leadership journey. Because the church doesn't just need your leadership, the church needs all of our leadership. We're all called to be leaders here at DPC, okay? You're all called to that apostleship, that I would call it, okay? Jesus would call it, you know, his disciples become apostles at the end of Matthew's journey. All right, so now if the leaders in the high-performing parishes are doing servant leadership, what I found is that the people in those parishes would be doing what in the business world they would call organizational citizenship, and in the church I would call it discipleship, or maybe stewardship, right? Some of the things that I found were things like being people simply helping each other out. One person goes down, someone helps them get back up. Or taking the initiative on a project without having to wait for somebody to tell you what to do. Or being able to participate. You know, participation simply means showing up, like you did today for this. Or self-developing, which is what you're doing now. Developing yourself into a better disciple of Christ and a better apostle for Christ. Cheerleading by speaking highly of the church when you get that opportunity. Or sportsmanship, giving people the benefit of the doubt when you're in conflict. And by the way, my slides, they'll become available. We're going to put them on the diocesan website, okay? So it'll be on the homepage right away, all 3 of these presentations, so you don't have to write all this down. And I would suggest that followership now becomes the best training for leadership. So practicing these discipleship and stewardship behaviors is the best practice for becoming a leader in the church as well. Now, when I do leadership training for my priests and deacons in my diocese, Davenport, Iowa, my bishop, Martin Amos, has suggested that this is the point that he wants me to emphasize the most, is delegation, okay? And delegation, we learn about delegation really very early on in a story about Jethro visiting Moses, where Moses is trying to do everything by himself, and his father-in-law Jethro comes in and says, Moses, what are you doing? You're wearing yourself out and you're wearing the people out by trying to do everything by yourself. Okay? And this is the same kind of tendency that we have today, isn't it? And so Jethro convinces Moses to train some of the other people to become lower level judges and hear some of the other cases so that it frees him up to hear the most difficult cases. And this is delegation. This is what all of us need to think about, particularly priests, deacons, or people in positions of authority, because we need to make sure that you're sharing leadership opportunities with other people. This is how Bishop Amos explained it to me. He says, number one, the priests are wearing themselves out, and the deacons. And number two, they're taking too many of the leadership opportunities away from the lay people. And we need to share as much as possible. Things that don't need to be done by a priest or a deacon, think about the ways that you can share that load by bringing forth, calling forth the gifts and talents within your parish and giving those opportunities to others to lead. All right? And the other big leadership behavior that I would suggest is key to servant leadership is listening, right? Listening. This is key. Bishop was talking about this yesterday, his importance of saying the first year is all about listening. In fact, you said then, I think it's probably going to be more like 10 years. Bishop, it never really stops, does it, right? You're just constantly, that's why God gives us 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? Actually, we should probably have 10 ears because we should be doing 10 times as much listening as we do speaking, right? And we have a whole week-long class that we teach, Leadership Through People Skills, that's basically about listening and communicating in order to become an effective leader. And this is one of my passions today is looking at the parables of Jesus now and trying to glean lessons for leadership. And in the parable of the sower and the seed, I would suggest that if we look at this parable from the point of view of the seed, not necessarily the sower who's spreading those seeds onto the fertile ground or onto the rocky ground or the thorny ground or the worn path, but if we think about ourselves as being the seed, okay, and how well do we nurture our own fertile soil. In fact, I would suggest that our opening reading from Habakkuk says it right in the first line. I will keep watch to see what God will say to me. Now, how do we hear the words of God? How do we hear the message of God? If we're trying to build the vision, as Habakkuk is suggesting in our opening reading, how do we hear this message from God? Well, a lot of times we do hear the word of God by reflecting in prayer. But we also hear the word of God by listening in dialogue with each other. And so I would suggest that listening is a very important part of this whole piece. And the parable of the seed, it suggests that there's 4 places, okay, to think about ourselves as fertile ground. The first place is if we're too busy, okay, if we're too busy, then we become that seed that falls on the worn path. Okay, the pathways that in Jesus' time would be between the various gardens that Jesus is talking about here in the sower and the seed. All right, so if we're too busy, then our seed, we're going to be on that worn path, and the seed's not going to find fertile ground. And if we're too shallow, okay, and we're not taking the time to really reflect on what it is that our mission is all about, if we don't take that reflective time, and by the way, as human beings, we have the ability to reflect, which means thinking about our thoughts, okay? We need to take more time to think about our thoughts and think about what it is that we've done at the end of each day. That's part of reflection, okay? So that's a part of a way of becoming deeper, because the seed that falls in the shallow ground, this is the rocky ground, because in first century Palestine, there were rocks sometimes an inch or 2 below the ground that the farmer or the sower couldn't see. But that seed begins to take root, but doesn't go very far because of the rocky soil. It's just not deep enough. And then the third kind of way of thinking about the ground and how we can make ourselves more fertile ground has to do with the seed that falls on the thorny ground, right? And this is where it's fertile ground, but there's too many distractions, okay? We have these thorns, these weeds that get in the way, and they choke us from being able to really fully listen. And so to think about ourselves as becoming more thorny ground means we need to get rid of some of those distractions in our life. And our biggest distraction, sociologists teach us, is right between our ears, okay? The biggest distraction is right here, because we're thinking about the past, things that we've made mistakes on, and we're thinking about the future, what we're going to do next. Or we're thinking about what we're going to say when we're in a conversation, right? We're already rehearsing what we're going to say while the other person's still speaking. That's another distraction. So to become really fully fertile ground in our discussions with each other, we need to become what sociologists would say generative listeners. And Jesus describes this as, at the end of his parable, he says, "Blessed is the person who hears the word of God and acts upon it." That's generative listening, according to sociologists, is where you hear the word and you act upon it. And that takes not only empathetic and active listening of getting outside of my needs and interests and away from the distractions in my own head, but it means being able to get to a place where I can fully understand your perspective and then be willing to change my perspective based on yours. Okay? This is really hard work, but it's the work of leadership, and it's the work that you're called to as diocesan pastoral council to engage in this kind of dialogue. Now, at the end of Matthew's gospel, all right, Jesus gives us the Great Commission. And I would suggest this commission is for you today. All right? In the same way that from Matthew 4 to Matthew 28, Jesus takes the disciples that he gathers in Matthew 24, and he trains and develops them into the leaders that he sends forth. Okay? Those are the people. Sent forth is the word apostle. Called forth is the word disciple. So the journey in Matthew's gospel is from discipleship to apostleship, from followership to leadership, from being students of Christ to teachers for Christ, okay? To becoming those evangelizers for Christ who are sent out, just like Jesus sent the apostles out in Matthew 28, he's sending you out today to be commissioned to lead in his church, okay? That's your call today. That was the call of the apostles back in the first century, and it continues to be the message for each and every one of us. So I would suggest these are the kinds of challenges that we face to become servant leaders, and welcome to this journey of servant leadership. Thank you very much.